The night was quiet in Moscow, but beneath the silence, unease was spreading like a shadow across the Kremlin walls. Russia, a nation that once prided itself on being untouchable, suddenly found itself vulnerable, not to missiles, not to tanks, not to bombs, but to something far more invisible, far more devastating. The blow did not come from the roar of fighter jets or the thunder of artillery. It came from silence, a silent strike that traveled across the world, one that carried the weight of strategy, precision, and patience. And at the center of it all was the United Kingdom. The story of how Britain struck Russia without firing a single shot begins years earlier, long before this conflict escalated, long before Moscow's illusions of invulnerability began to crack. To understand the present, one must travel back into the corridors of history, to an era when empires defined themselves not only through warfare, but through influence, trade, and the power of the unseen. The roots of the silent war for centuries. The United Kingdom and Russia danced on opposite sides of Europe's power stage. From the days of the Crimean War in the 19th century to the rivalries of the Cold War, their relationship was marked by suspicion, strategy, and a deep, unspoken rivalry. Britain, the naval power that controlled the seas, and Russia, the vast land empire that dreamed of warm water ports, were destined to clash in ways that didn't always involve direct confrontation. But what happened in this modern era was different, and like the bloody wars of the past, the battlefield now was economic, digital, and psychological. The weapons were no longer cannons or rifles, but sanctions, intelligence operations, cyber strategies, and the manipulation of global finance. And here, the UK, often underestimated in discussions dominated by the United States or the European Union, found its strength. Britain struck where it hurt most: Russia's financial arteries, its global image, and its network of oligarchs who sustained the Kremlin's power. The oligarchs' web for years, London was a playground for Russia's wealthy elite. Billionaire oligarchs, tied directly or indirectly to the Kremlin, poured their money into Britain's real estate, banks, luxury goods, and even its political influence. Londongrad, as it came to be called, became a safe haven for Russian money. Mansions in Kensington, football clubs, luxury cars. The city was dripping with Russian wealth. But this golden bridge became the very target that Britain would one day weaponize. The UK government began to build a dossier. Quietly, discreetly, intelligence agencies mapped out the oligarchic web. Who funded whom, where the money traveled, which shell companies hid the Kremlin's gold. Every link was carefully documented. Every offshore account was tracked. Every suspicious transaction was followed like a trail of breadcrumbs leading back to Moscow.
Behind the scenes, Britain's intelligence services, Michigan 5, Michigan 6, and GCHQ, waged another kind of war. Cyber operations targeted Russian networks. Intelligence leaks exposed corruption, hidden accounts, and political manipulations. Moscow's secrets, once guarded in shadows, began to leak into daylight. What hurt Russia most was not just the sanctions or the economic strangling, but the humiliation. The Kremlin, which thrived on the projection of strength, suddenly looked weak. Its billionaires were homeless in London. Its companies were banned from trading in the world's financial capitals. Its energy dominance was fading. And the world saw it. The psychological blow. Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with perception. The UK understood this. Every frozen mansion, every seized yacht, every sanctioned oligarch was not just an economic hit, it was a symbol. A message to the Russian people and to the world: your wealth, your power, your reach is not untouchable. Moscow began to realize that the war it had started was not just on the battlefield of Ukraine. It was everywhere, in banks, in boardrooms, in diplomatic halls, in public opinion. And Britain had struck where it hurt most: Russia's pride. A brewing storm, but this was only the beginning. The strike that Britain delivered was silent, yes, but its consequences were loud. The oligarchs whispered in frustration. The Kremlin scrambled for alternatives. The Russian economy trembled as the ruble wavered, and international isolation deepened. And yet, Moscow prepared to retaliate. The question hanging in the air was simple, chilling, and unavoidable. If Britain had struck Russia without firing a shot, what would Russia do next? Would it seek revenge in kind, through cyber warfare, espionage, disinformation? Or would it lash out with the very weapons it still held in its arsenal? The silent war had only just begun. The echoes of Britain's bold maneuver reverberated across Europe. While no missiles had flown and no fighter jets had scrambled, the effect of the strike was undeniable. Russia, for all its vastness and military might, had been hit where it was most vulnerable, not in the skies or on the battlefield, but in the silent corridors of finance, energy, and global reputation. In Moscow, the Kremlin struggled to contain the fallout. Putin convened a midnight meeting in the gilded halls of the Kremlin palace, summoning his top ministers, energy chiefs, and intelligence directors. His voice was calm, but his clenched fists revealed the storm brewing beneath. "They think we can be starved into submission," he declared, his words echoing across the marble. "The British have always fancied themselves clever. But this is not 1940. They will pay for their arrogance." But behind the fiery rhetoric, the truth was undeniable. Britain had succeeded in cutting into the very arteries of Russia's survival. By tightening sanctions on energy trading, seizing billions in shadow assets, and pushing allies to freeze Russian sovereign reserves, London had created a chokehold that Moscow's generals could not counter with tanks or artillery. The ripple effect spread quickly. Russian oligarchs, long considered untouchable, were now cornered. Mansions in Belgravia, Mayfair, and the English countryside sat empty, their iron gates locked, their luxury cars repossessed. Yachts worth hundreds of millions that once gleamed in British harbors were seized, draped with the Union Jack as symbols of London's unflinching resolve. For the first time in decades, the Kremlin's wealthy elite found themselves powerless, unable to protect their treasures from the reach of British law. And it wasn't just about the money, it was psychological. These oligarchs had sent their children to British schools, vacationed in the Lake District, and dined in London's Michelin-starred restaurants. Britain had been their sanctuary, their playground. Now it was the executioner of their wealth. Meanwhile, ordinary Russians began to feel the sting. Prices for imported goods soared, the ruble wavered on the brink of collapse, and entire sectors of the economy slowed to a crawl. Banks restricted withdrawals, fearing panicked runs. And all of it came without a single shot fired by the British military. In London, Prime Minister's aides quietly celebrated what they called the invisible strike. Intelligence officials marveled at the precision of the move, coordinated, timed, and executed with near military perfection. One senior MI6 officer remarked, "This is modern warfare, disabling an enemy's strength without firing a bullet. Russia expected bombs, we gave them silence. And silence can be louder than explosions." But Russia was not one to take humiliation lightly. Inside the Kremlin, discussions shifted toward retaliation, not militarily against Britain, which would risk NATO's full wrath, but through subtler, asymmetric means. Cyberattacks on British infrastructure, covert influence campaigns in Europe, disinformation designed to sow division, all of it was placed on the table. The first salvos came quickly. A wave of coordinated cyberattacks hit British financial systems. ATMs malfunctioned in parts of London, payment networks briefly froze, and flights were delayed due to sudden technical failures. Though no lives were lost, the disruptions rattled the public. For a few hours, chaos simmered in Britain's capital. Yet the UK was ready. Cyber defense units worked around the clock, isolating and neutralizing the attacks. Within a day, systems were restored. British newspapers ran headlines declaring victory in a digital battle of Britain, portraying the cyber clash as another failed attempt by Moscow to shake the island nation's resolve. Meanwhile, across Europe, something more profound was happening. Britain's move had inspired others. Germany, once hesitant to push too far, began reevaluating its energy policies. France increased pressure on Moscow by targeting Russian shipping companies. Even smaller nations, emboldened by the UK's leadership, took steps to sever financial ties with Russian elites. The Kremlin watched nervously as its network of influence began to unravel. What had once been a delicate web of money, politics, and corruption stretching from London to Paris to Berlin was now being cut thread by thread. And Britain's strike had been the scissors. But the true genius of the UK's move lay not in its immediate consequences, but in the seeds it planted. Russia's long-standing reliance on Western financial systems and its entanglement with Europe's economies had been exposed for the world to see. Allies who once wavered now saw vulnerability in Moscow that could be exploited. As winter approached, Britain delivered its second silent strike, this time through energy policy. Using its North Sea reserves, renewable expansion, and deepened ties with Norway and the US, the UK orchestrated a European coalition to fill the gaps left by Russian gas. Prices initially spiked, but alternative routes stabilized the market. Suddenly, Moscow's greatest weapon, its control over Europe's heating and electricity, began to lose its power. In Russia, energy executives panicked. Billions in future revenue evaporated overnight. Projects once deemed profitable were now worthless. Workers in Siberian oil towns faced layoffs, and regional governors feared unrest. For Putin, it was a nightmare. His carefully built image of invincibility, the strongman who stood against the West, was cracking, not because of tanks or missiles, but because Britain had quietly cut the financial lifeline that sustained his empire. And so the question arose, could Russia withstand a war where the battlefield was not land or sky, but the invisible realms of finance, cyber, and diplomacy? Inside Downing Street, the answer was clear. Britain had struck Russia where it hurt most, not in its territory, but in its pride, its wealth, and its future. The war was no longer just about Ukraine. It was about the shape of the world order. And in this struggle, Britain had shown that one nation, through precision, intelligence, and resilience, could cripple a giant, without ever firing a shot. The silence of this strike would echo louder than any bomb, reshaping history in ways that neither Moscow nor London could yet fully grasp.